The first words my wife spoke in divorce court echoed through the room, loud enough that every conversation died instantly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "he's nothing more than a washed-up Marine veteran." Silence settled over the courtroom. Even the hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt loud. No one shifted in their seat. No one looked away. Every pair of eyes landed on me, as if I were a man whose entire life had just been summed up in one cruel sentence. I looked across the room at Linda. 32 years of marriage sat behind those distant eyes. She wore a light blue blazer I had bought for our anniversary years earlier, but she refused to meet my gaze. Then I turned toward the judge. He had just reached for his coffee when I quietly spoke. "Judge Morgan, do you remember me?" His hand froze. For a second he stared at me, confused. Then the color drained from his face. He stood so abruptly that his chair rolled backward across the floor. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Frank Dalton?" The atmosphere changed in an instant. Linda's attorney, Russell Green, had spent the last 40 minutes portraying me as a broken old veteran who had emotionally abandoned his wife. Until that moment, he looked completely confident. Now he suddenly looked nervous. Judge Harold Morgan couldn't take his eyes off me. Truthfully, maybe he was seeing a ghost, because the man sitting in that courtroom was no longer the Marine gunnery sergeant who had once carried him through raging floodwaters more than 2 decades earlier. That younger man had stronger knees. He slept through the night. He still believed life eventually became simple after war. The bailiff cleared his throat. "Your Honor." Judge Morgan slowly sat back down, still staring at me. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." The courtroom immediately erupted into whispers. Linda finally looked at me with genuine confusion. "What was that?" she asked. I simply shrugged. Old memories. Her attorney leaned toward me. "Mr. Dalton, do you know the judge personally?" "Not really." That answer was true in its own way. You never truly know someone whose life once depended on your grip during the worst night of his life. You simply never forget him. But before I explain why Judge Morgan reacted that way, I need to go back. I grew up outside Jacksonville, North Carolina. In my hometown, nearly every family had someone connected to the Marine Corps. My father fought in Korea. My older brother never came home from Vietnam. Joining the Marines never felt like a choice. It felt like destiny. I served 26 years. Most of what happened during those years stayed locked inside me. Men from my generation weren't taught to speak about fear, grief, or nightmares. We carried them quietly. When I met Linda in 1989 at a church fundraiser in Wilmington, she loved that quiet confidence. She laughed at one of my terrible barbecue jokes, and I remember thinking I'd never seen a warmer smile. Back then, she didn't care that I drove an old pickup truck. She didn't care that my dress blues had already seen years of service. She always said I made her feel safe. For a long time, life was good. Not perfect. Real. Mortgage payments. Family dinners. Friday nights watching game shows together. Raising our son, Michael, in a modest house a few miles from the Carolina coast. Those ordinary moments became the happiest years of my life. But people rarely change overnight. They change one disappointment at a time. After I retired from the Marines, everything inside me became heavier. Sleep stopped bringing rest. Crowded stores made my chest tighten. Some mornings I would sit in my truck outside the hardware store for 10 minutes just trying to convince myself to walk inside. Linda thought I was becoming distant. The truth was much harder to explain. I wasn't angry. I was exhausted in ways sleep could never fix. Unfortunately, I never found the words. So I stayed silent. Silence has a way of eating a marriage from the inside. Over the years, Linda's career in real estate introduced her to wealthier circles. Country clubs. Luxury homes. People whose lives looked polished and effortless. Compared to their husbands, I suppose I started looking ordinary. Just an aging Marine who volunteered with veterans and wore the same brown winter jacket every year. After Michael moved to Raleigh, the house became painfully quiet. That was when little criticisms began. The way I folded towels. The way I chewed my food. The old Ford pickup I refused to replace. Eventually, we barely spoke unless something needed to be discussed. Then one morning, while we were drinking coffee, Linda calmly asked for a divorce. "I feel like I settled," she said. I simply nodded. I'd survived combat. Yet somehow those words hurt differently. I never argued. She could keep most of the furniture. We sold the boat. I even agreed to split my retirement without a fight. By then, money didn't matter much to me anymore. Respect did. What broke me wasn't losing the marriage. It was hearing 32 years reduced to a single insult. Worthless veteran. The strange part? Those words didn't hurt nearly as much as they should have. Because deep inside, I knew Linda wasn't only disappointed in me. She was disappointed in the life she thought we'd have. That's how we ended up sitting across from each other in divorce court. Her attorney wanted the house, my savings, even the small fishing property my father had left me. I honestly didn't care about any of it. But I had no idea that before the day was over, the courtroom would discover a chapter of my life I had spent 24 years trying to leave behind. 123. When the recess ended, Judge Morgan returned to the bench looking very different from the man who had walked out. His face was calm again, but his eyes never left mine. "Before we continue," he said, "I need to speak privately with Mr. Dalton." Linda's attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object." "You're welcome to object," Judge Morgan replied evenly. "I'm still going to do it." The bailiff led me through a narrow hallway lined with faded photographs of former judges. Morgan's chambers were modest, bookshelves packed with law books, family pictures on the walls, and a small lighthouse sitting on the windowsill. The moment the door closed behind us, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped forward and wrapped me in a firm embrace. "You're alive," he whispered. I smiled faintly. "So are you." He shook his head in disbelief. "I searched for you for years." "That surprises me." "You disappeared." "I was transferred after the storm," I answered. "Then came more deployments. Life kept moving." He nodded slowly. "Life has a way of doing that." For a moment we simply stood there, two older men carrying decades neither of us could erase. Finally he asked, "Do you still remember that night?" I gave a tired smile. "Every time it rains." My mind drifted back 24 years. A powerful hurricane had slammed into the Carolina coast. Roads disappeared beneath floodwater. Power lines snapped. Families were trapped inside flooded homes while emergency calls overwhelmed every radio channel. At the time, I was serving as a Marine gunnery sergeant assigned to emergency evacuation support. Harold Morgan was a young federal prosecutor visiting the area for an investigation. None of that mattered once the storm arrived. By midnight, entire neighborhoods had become rivers. Our rescue team received reports of civilians stranded near Cedar Point. The current was so violent our commanding officer ordered everyone to wait until daylight. I couldn't. Sometimes experience tells you waiting will cost lives. 2 Marines volunteered to go with me. We launched an inflatable rescue raft into water that barely looked like a street anymore. Rain struck so hard it felt like gravel. Trees floated past us. Power transformers exploded in the distance. Then we found them. Several civilians clung desperately to a street sign surrounded by rushing water. Among them was Harold Morgan. One arm gripped the sign. The other held an elderly woman above the current. I shouted for him to let go. His answer came immediately. Not without her. Even then I admired him. We pulled every civilian into the raft one by one. Just as Morgan climbed aboard, a powerful wave slammed into us. The raft nearly flipped. I tore my shoulder, dragging him inside. That injury never fully healed. Cold weather still reminds me of that night. Back in the judge's chambers, Morgan quietly opened a desk drawer. He removed a small cloth bundle and carefully unfolded it. Resting inside was an old Marine Corps challenge coin. Mine. I hadn't seen it since that rescue. You gave me this in the ambulance, he said. You told me surviving means you owe something back to the people who didn't get the same chance. I chuckled softly. That sounds like something I'd say. It changed my life. He wasn't exaggerating. Over the years, I'd occasionally seen his name in newspapers. Assistant prosecutor, state judge, eventually superior court judge, a reputation built on honesty. He placed the coin back on the desk before looking directly at me. Frank, what happened to you? There were 100 answers. War happened. Retirement happened. Funerals happened. Loneliness happened. Instead, I simply said, I got tired. He understood immediately. Older men often do. Then his expression became serious. I have to ask, because it's part of my responsibility. I nodded. Did you ever threaten your wife? No. Hide assets? No. Abuse her? Never. He held my gaze for several seconds before quietly saying, That matches everything I've seen. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the coastline. Morgan loosened his tie. Your wife's attorney is trying to paint you as unstable because of your military service. I figured. But there's something he doesn't know. He opened another folder. Inside were dozens of letters. Some handwritten, some typed, some yellowed with age. They've been arriving for years, he explained. The first letter came from a former Marine whose addiction treatment had been paid for anonymously. The second came from a military widow whose mortgage had quietly been covered for months after her husband died. Another came from a young corporal who admitted I had talked him out of ending his own life. I looked away. I had never expected anyone to remember those moments. You kept these? I asked. Morgan nodded. People don't forget kindness, Frank. For several seconds I couldn't find my voice. Somewhere along the way I'd convinced myself that after retirement people slowly forgot you, that your best years simply disappeared. Morgan closed the folder. Everyone outside thinks this divorce is about property, he said quietly. I don't. What do you think it's about? He looked me straight in the eye. It's about dignity. Those words settled deep inside me. For the first time since Linda filed for divorce, I realized this wasn't really about winning or losing. It was about the truth. When we walked back into the courtroom together, conversations stopped instantly. Judge Morgan pulled out his chair before taking his seat. Linda noticed. So did her attorney. Neither of them understood what had happened behind those closed doors. But both of them knew something had changed. And before the day was over, the truth none of us had spoken aloud for years would finally come into the open. 12:23. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had completely changed. Earlier that morning, I had been treated like an old man standing in the way of his wife's future. Now people looked at me differently. Not because they suddenly knew me, but because they sensed there was far more to my life than anyone had realized. Judge Morgan remained calm and impartial, giving neither side special treatment. The financial testimony continued. My pension, the house, my savings, my father's small fishing property. Everything a marriage is reduced to, once love begins to disappear. Then Linda's attorney stood again. Mr. Dalton, would you agree that your emotional distance played a major role in the failure of your marriage? Yes, I answered honestly. He looked surprised. And would you also agree your military experiences left you psychologically damaged? Yes. The room fell silent. He smiled slightly, believing he had finally gained control. So your condition made you incapable of being a proper husband. I looked toward Linda before answering. No. He frowned. I carried wounds, I said calmly, but I never stopped loving my wife. Those words landed harder than I expected. Linda lowered her eyes, fighting back tears. The attorney tried once more. Love without communication can still become neglect. I nodded. Sometimes that's true. Then something happened that no one expected. Linda slowly stood. That's enough. Everyone turned toward her. She looked at her attorney first. "You keep describing my husband like he's some dangerous man." Her voice trembled. "He isn't." The courtroom became completely silent. "Frank never abused me." She swallowed hard. "He never cheated. He never stopped providing for our family. He simply stopped letting anyone see how much pain he was carrying." Her attorney looked stunned. She continued before he could interrupt. "I spent years comparing our life to people who had bigger houses, newer cars, and expensive vacations." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot who I married." I couldn't speak. Not because I had won, because hearing those words after 32 years hurt almost as much as losing the marriage itself. Then Linda reached into her purse. She carefully unfolded an old handwritten letter. The moment I recognized my own handwriting, my chest tightened. It was the anniversary letter I had written years earlier during one of my worst winters. I had never found the courage to give it to her. With shaking hands, she began reading aloud. "I know living with me hasn't always been easy. Sometimes I feel like part of me never truly came home. But none of that was ever your fault. I loved you before the battles inside my mind, and I still love you today." By the time she finished, no one in the courtroom moved. She looked directly at me. "Why didn't you give me this?" I answered with the only truth I had. "Because I thought my words didn't matter anymore." Judge Morgan quietly finished the hearing. 2 weeks later, the divorce became final. The settlement was fair. Linda kept the family home. I moved into a small cabin near the Carolina marshes, where the mornings were quiet and the nights slowly became easier to live with. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt like an enemy. I began volunteering at the local Veterans Center, helping older service members with paperwork, medical claims, and transportation. Many of them didn't need money. They simply needed someone willing to sit beside them. One afternoon, I looked up from my desk and saw Linda standing in the doorway carrying a tray of coffee. The room became awkward. Several veterans recognized her from the court hearing. Still, she walked inside. "I brought coffee," she said softly. An old Navy veteran pointed toward an empty table. "Well, don't just stand there." Laughter broke the tension. She started volunteering once a week, then twice. Soon she was helping military families, listening to widows, organizing donations, and comforting people who reminded her of everything she had once failed to notice. We never became husband and wife again. Some things break too slowly to ever return to what they were. But respect found its way back. And surprisingly, so did friendship. Our son Michael noticed it immediately. For the first time in years, family dinners no longer felt like walking through a battlefield. Then came Veterans Day. My granddaughter Emma begged me to attend her school's ceremony. Crowds still made me uncomfortable, but saying no to her had never been easy. Judge Morgan was the guest speaker. Near the end of his speech, he looked straight at me. "People often mistake quiet people for ordinary people," he said. "But some of the strongest men I've ever known never asked for recognition." He smiled. "Frank Dalton. Would you please stand?" I sighed and slowly rose. The entire gymnasium stood with me. Teachers, parents, children, veterans. The applause wasn't loud. It was something better. It was sincere. Emma squeezed my hand and whispered proudly, "Grandpa, everybody likes you." I smiled. Being liked isn't what matters. What does? I looked around the room before answering. Being kind when nobody is watching. A few days later, Linda visited my cabin carrying a small wooden box. Inside was the folded American flag from my retirement ceremony. She held it carefully before looking at me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I stopped seeing who you really were." I nodded. "And I'm sorry I stopped letting you." As the sun settled over the marsh, we unfolded the flag together and showed Emma how to fold it back into a perfect triangle, just as my father had once taught me. 3 generations stood together in peaceful silence. Not everything had been repaired, but understanding had finally replaced resentment. And sometimes, after a lifetime of carrying invisible burdens, that is enough.